the enormous pleasure of, whoop, am I muted? No, I'm not muted, okay. I've had the enormous pleasure of knowing Rudy Fichtenbaum for a fairly long time now, and I have been admiring his work. And so when Mark and Jacob and Stefan asked us to invite Rudy to come speak to the chapter, I was particularly supportive of that because I just think he's colossally wonderful. Rudy has been involved with the AUP and particularly with the collective bargaining chapters for quite some time. He comes from Wright State and has done a lot of work in Ohio in particular, not just at his own university in terms of improving public higher education in Ohio, and sort of took that interest and moved it into the kind of national spotlight. In 2012, he became president of the national chapter of the AAUP and served there until last year. And during that time, he really supervised a lot of important transitions at the AAUP. The national organization underwent a kind of finishing of the restructuring. But also more importantly, I think that he was one of the people who very much supported the One Faculty campaign. And that was an effort not just to expand the AAUP, but to expand it to be more broad in its outlook, to understand that it's not just the tenure stream faculty, it's also all of the contingent faculty that make the university operate, and that it was important for all the units of the university to work essentially as partners in higher ed. And that has significantly changed the nature of the AUP in many ways. I will also point out that the number of collective bargaining chapters expanded significantly. There were important drives to bring in membership, particularly on the West Coast. And so the AUP looked very different after Rudy's presidency than it looked before. And I think it's a much better AUP as a result. So without further ado, let me introduce Rudy Fichtenbaum. He will be talking today. His speech title is "Has Neoliberalism Run Its Course? The AUP, Politics, and the Common Good." And thank you, Rudy.
All right, well, it's a pleasure to speak with you all. And when I was president of the AAUP, I had a lot of bad ideas that never really worked out, but the One Faculty campaign was one I think that actually got some traction, and I'm glad about that. So in any event, when I was thinking about this, I guess I was supposed to talk to you, I think it was almost about exactly a year ago, and then it got canceled. And I guess a lot has happened in a year, some good, some bad. But when I was thinking about, well, what could be different about a talk that I would be giving now versus one that I would have given last year. And that was when it sort of dawned on me that, perhaps there's some real new opportunities for us here, but there's also still a lot of uncertainty. So I think what we've seen is that, neoliberals have been attacking public services, including higher education now, for more than 40 years. And the tenets of neoliberalism are the rule of markets, cutting taxes on the wealthy, reducing public expenditures that support working and middle-class families, the mass incarceration of African-American males in particular, deregulation, privatization, attacks on unions, and the elimination of public goods. It also, we see growing income inequality and stagnant real wages for working people. And that's a measure of the success of the neoliberal agenda. Reduced funding has precipitated the privatization of higher education, skyrocketing tuition and soaring student debt. Simultaneously, US higher education is more corporatized. For example, we have exorbitantly paid professional administrators who manage what many corporations and politicians view now as the business of higher education. And as higher education has been transformed into a business, college and university administrators have become managers and have adopted all kinds of business lingo. And they now talk about education as an investment. They constantly use terms like productivity, outsourcing, consumer satisfaction, RIO, which is the return on investment, strategic investments. They even speak of institutions as if they were a marketplace for ideas. College and university administrations have now embarked on this corporate model, which is fundamentally transforming higher education and changing the way decisions are made. Administrators are now making decisions unilaterally and in response to external market forces. We need not look far to see these effects. The corporate model is driving decisions about the development or the discontinuance of programs. They use paid consultants for searches, curricular changes that facilitate transfers and shorten the time to obtain a degree, changes in admission standards, increases in tuition as institutions compete for ranking, and changes in standards for tenure. The corporate model's encroachment, with this encroachment, we have witnessed dramatically higher salaries for presidents and others near the top, as well as a proliferation of administrators, associate provosts, assistant vice president, deputy deans, and so on infinitum. The corporatized university is overstaffed in administrators. Count the vice presidents, associate vice presidents, assistant vice presidents, deans, associate deans, assistant deans, all of whom have their own assistant and deputy assistants. Look at the organization chart for a university. Most organization charts have so many layers that one needs multiple pages with each division and subdivision having its own chart. Google the word administratium and laugh at the humor, but cry at the underlying truth. If you've never read that little piece, it's worth seeing. Remember, this army of administrators does not teach students or undertake research. Instead, it directs the growing ranks of untenured, insecure, and underpaid faculty working on contingent contracts, telling them what to teach, how to teach it, and reminding them that giving too many mediocre grades is a no-no, regardless of actual student performance. It fawns over fat cat donations that have partially replaced the ever shrinking public funding and strings attached thereto. It leeches resources, money from public goods of teaching, students, and conducting independent research, and instead diverts them to intercollegiate athletics, hiring consultants, the purchase of real estate, the creation of affiliated entities whose ostensible purpose is to attract additional funding, even if that money has strings attached. Beyond the erosion of faculty governance and academic matters, we see growing inequality both within and between institutions as market forces intrude. Vast salary differences now exist among tenured and tenure track faculty and between disciplines. There is also a growing gulf between faculty salaries at private institutions and those at public ones, a consequence in part of diminished state funding. However, the greatest increase in inequality among faculty has followed from the explosive growth in the use and abuse of non-tenure track faculty, especially part-time faculty working for abysmally low pay with neither benefits nor job security. In large part, this has resulted from the phasing out of tenure. While the decision to hire more and more faculty off the tenure track is not the responsibility of tenured faculty, it is absolutely the case that tenured faculty have not fought hard enough to protect full-time non-tenured track and part-time faculty, often treating them as second-class citizens. While many full-time non-tenure track and part-time faculty clearly recognize they are simply at-will employees, many of the tenure track faculty have not yet come to terms with the fact that, one, they are an endangered species, and two, that as their critical mass has declined, the protections of tenure do not have the same meaning that they had 40 years ago. And as evidence of that, ask the 95 tenured faculty at the University of Akron who just lost their job earlier this year. This can clearly be seen with the rise of targeted harassment, the growing interference of corporations and foundations and politicians, which pose grave threats to academic freedom and shared governance. In many cases, tenured faculty are like the proverbial frog who is put in a pot of boiling water, put in a pot of cold water, and doesn't realize the temperature is rising until it's too late and they are cooked. The working conditions for faculty are the learning conditions for students. Indeed, it is hard to meet students and help them while sharing an office with 1, 2, 10, or other faculty. How can students make appointments to see faculty members with no office telephone and no office computer? Faculty without secretarial assistance must type and duplicate all handouts and assignments and exams for themselves. How does one duplicate exams without access to copiers? Moreover, diverting time to these other functions diminishes the time helping students or preparing for class. Although pay, benefits, and working conditions for full-time contingent non-tenure track faculty tend to be better than those of their part-time counterparts, they are often excluded from decisions over curriculum and academic policy. So they have no ownership of the curriculum and they teach and thus have little stake in how well it is delivered. Also, since most are hired for a year at a time, they recognize they are always just one bad student evaluation away from being fired. Thus, they are less likely to hold students to appropriately rigorous academic standards, to introduce them to controversial ideas, or otherwise teach as if they had an appropriate voice in curriculum and academic policy. So having a high percentage of our faculty employed on a contingent basis is a problem, and not only for these faculty members. It is a problem for the students because it diminishes the quality of the education they receive. It is a problem for society because when faculty lack the protection, they lack tenure to teach about controversial ideas, students are less likely to become critical thinkers on which a truly democratic society depends. When faculty only deliver curriculum rather than also developing it, what's taught is more likely to be dictated by corporate interests who want clones trained to produce rather than human beings educated to think. For example, administrators who may be more concerned about course completion, graduation rates can dictate what textbooks are used and even purchase entire courses that have been developed by Pearson or McGraw-Hill. Moreover, faculty who work as at-will employees are less likely to engage in independent research, to comment candidly on institutional policy, or speak freely about matters of broad public concern. After all, criticism of the president of the university or of the US and publishing research challenging the status quo, whether it's in physics, medicine, history, or politics, can bring swift retribution and the loss of one's job. For example, Louisiana State University fired a non-tenured associate professor of civil engineering, civil and environmental engineering, who found the Army Corps of Engineers was responsible for the catastrophic failure of levees during Hurricane Katrina. His superiors fired him because they believed his views might jeopardize future funding for LSU. Democracy suffers for students taught to think for themselves, and faculty who are unafraid to challenge the ideology of the moment are not what society's fat cats, powerful corporations, and wealthy individuals desire. With this transformation, there have arisen more and more attacks on academic freedom, shared governance, and the economic security of the faculty, all of which merit places on the endangered species list. Institutions now rely on high-priced consultants to reshape their curricula and pick academic programs for elimination. Though these changes initially targeted humanities and social sciences, the loss of shared governance has propagated into other fields as well. In all programs, administrators seek to dumb down the curriculum in an attempt to increase graduation rates, bolster retention, and ultimately to support the metastasizing administrative bureaucracy. The neoliberal agenda in higher education has transformed what was a world-class system of public higher education, whose goal was to provide high-quality education with a strong foundation in liberal arts and sciences at a price within the reach of most families, into a system more suited to serve corporate interests. Now, at the top of our higher education system are the elite private universities funded with large endowments, where most of our top corporate leaders and politicians are educated. Just look at the Supreme Court. Nobody from Oakland University or Wright State or Cal State on there, right? So below these are the top public research universities, educating large numbers of corporate leaders and engaging in high levels of research, largely funded from federal sources, much of which ultimately can be commercialized. Below the top tier are the majority of public and private universities and colleges, and below them lie community colleges with their emphasis on vocational training. These institutions, especially the public ones, are increasingly pressured to emphasize training, certification, and degree completion. Likewise, when research is undertaken at all, it is likely to be applied research aimed at economic development, a code for private profit. Corporations want a bountiful supply of skilled but docile workers. They want productivity, but not well-educated citizens who might question growing levels of inequality, mass incarceration, environmental degradation, the defunding of public schools and higher education, and other social ills. They want applied research they can transform into private profit. What is tenure and why is it important? The purpose of tenure is to protect academic freedom. Academic freedom guarantees that faculty can explore controversial ideas in our classrooms, in our research and scholarship, and speak out on issues of public concern using our expertise as professionals. Every faculty member needs academic freedom, whether she or he is tenured, tenure track, full-time, non-tenure track, or part-time. Why do faculty need academic freedom? Put another way, What is so special about faculty that they should get to express ideas at work without fear of reprisal from administrators or politicians? The general public view protections for faculty skeptically, wondering why faculty deserve this special protection. Most workers know that if they say something at work that's viewed unfavorably by their employer, they can be fired in a heartbeat. At the same time, when the politics of envy reign supreme, if we cannot explain to the public the real reason why faculty need academic freedom, then we will lose academic freedom and with it tenure, which is already on life support. I don't pretend for a minute to be a scholar when it comes to understanding the reasons for the founding of the AAUP. If this is a topic you're interested in, I highly recommend that you read University Reform, the Founding of the American Association of University Professors by Hans-Georg Tita, who now works for the AAUP. But from what little I know about our founding documents, the founders of AAUP saw academic freedom and therefore tenure not as a reward for scholarship or as a way of simply providing faculty with more job security than ordinary workers because we were professionals or had PhDs. The history is complicated, and there definitely were people who saw the role of AAUP as professionalizing the faculty to make them more like doctors and lawyers, seeing professionals as being better than quote unquote ordinary workers. At the turn of the century, doctors and lawyers were not more highly trained than faculty. What set them apart was largely they were self-employed, giving them control over their work. But the problem for faculty was they could not be self-employed because they worked for trustees. But setting up a system of tenure, protecting themselves from outside interference, gave them more control over their working environment so that they would not be treated as if they were, and this is the word they used back then, hired men. At the same time, the founders of the AAUP saw higher education as serving the common good. In the 1940 statement on academic freedom and tenure states that institutions of higher education are conducted for the common good and not to further either the interests of either an individual teacher or institution as a whole. The common good depends on free speech, the free search for truth and its free exposition. Academic freedom can serve the public good only if universities as institutions are free from outside pressures in the realm of their academic mission, unquote. Recognizing that trustees represented business interests, a point made by Torsten Veblen in his book, Higher Learning in America, a memorandum on the conduct of universities by businessmen, published in 1907, they saw academic freedom as a way of insulating themselves from business interests or the whims of politicians who often served as trustees, in a way that is fundamentally rooted in the belief that objective reality exists and it is the task of scholars to continually advance and transmit knowledge, a process limited by disciplinary norms. The founders of the AAUP believed that an educated citizenry was the foundation of a democratic society, which would protect the interests of the majority against narrow, quote unquote, special interests and corruption. Putting this in a more modern vernacular, we might say the purpose of higher education is to serve the interests of the 99%, despite the fact that our trustees and most politicians largely represent the interests of the top 1%. So academic freedom and tenure were not about protecting faculty as individuals per se, but about ensuring that colleges and universities serve the public interest. Academic freedom and tenure are not about us, They are about ensuring that colleges and universities are not captured or bought and paid for by special interests funded by conservative foundations, example, the Koch brothers, the Bradley, Olin, Scaife, Coors, so that they can continue to serve the interests of the overwhelming majority of people who live in this country and indeed live on our planet. What about shared governance? What is shared governance? Is it just workplace democracy? If that's the case, why are faculty more deserving than other workers of having a say in how their workplace is run? Risa Leibowitz, AAUP's general counsel, is a wonderful scholar and expert on academic freedom and shared governance, and she has argued that shared governance is a collective expression of academic freedom by the faculty as a whole. It is shared governance that allows the faculty to collectively control the curriculum, the academic programs that will be offered or discontinued, to determine academic policies and control hiring and tenure decisions. This type of control is again important to insulate these decisions from corporate interests and politicians that ultimately control our institutions. Ultimately, shared governance is the collective voice of the faculty writ large, and it is our responsibility to see that colleges and universities serve the public interest. Clearly, one of the things our chapters and conferences must do is a better job explaining to faculty themselves the reasons for tenure, academic freedom, and shared governance, and the economic precarity of the majority of faculty. Then we must take our case into the arena of public opinion, and I'll have more to say about that later. So what might the future hold for our profession? What's on the horizon? Unless we act, we will continue to see declining real wages for all faculty, making it harder to attract the best and the brightest to our profession. For those full-time faculty lucky enough to have health insurance, premiums will keep rising, but more importantly, co-pays, deductibles, co-insurance, and maximum out-of-pockets will also continue to rise, shifting the burden to those who are sick and can least afford the additional cost, eroding what it means to have insurance. Nearly half the faculty in the US do not have employer-provided health insurance and are forced to seek health insurance on private exchanges or through Medicaid. The Republican Party had pledged to wipe out these exchanges and the Medicaid expansion, a pledge that turned out to be impossible to keep, despite the fact that they control all three branches of government. However, these programs will continue to be attacked, and people who rely on them will see benefits erode and will have obstacles such as work requirements put in place so they cannot get the coverage they need. Public sector faculty with pensions have seen their pensions looted by Wall Street and will continue to see quote unquote pension reform, a euphemism for cuts in pension benefits levied on even on those who have already retired. Institutions, both public and private, without pensions will contribute less to individual retirement accounts. These faculty will continue to have the do-it-yourself retirement plan, something my colleague Howard Buncis refers to as the pine box retirement plan. Even in the face of the worst pandemic in more than a century, we have seen an all-out attack on science. I am sure many of you believe that atoms have three major components: electrons, protons, and neutrons. But now there's a new theory gaining currency that atoms have four major components: electrons, protons, neutrons, and morons. That's a joke. But seriously, we will continue to see attacks on science, particularly science dealing with climate change, because the implications of recognizing that climate change is caused by human activity is a threat to many powerful interests. We will continue to hear complaints about liberal professors in the humanities. And finally, after years of eroding tenure via attrition, it now appears that the enemy is massing for a frontal assault on tenure to finish off remaining tenured faculty in most of our institutions, particularly the non-elite institutions that serve working people and students of color. The 2008 financial crisis, followed by the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, have been seen as opportunities to reshape higher education, to remake the curriculum and eliminate tenure altogether. Retrenchment, firing tenured faculty without declaring financial exigency, and mass layoffs of untenured faculty are the order of the day. Meanwhile, administrators continue their support for money-losing ventures, investing in real estate, subsidizing intercollegiate athletics, and continuing to borrow money to erect facilities which are fast becoming monuments at institutions devoid of students and faculty. Institutions that serve working class students and students of color have been particularly hard hit. This new attack follows up more than a decade of stepped up attacks on academic freedom through the use of targeted online harassment encouraged by websites such as Professor Watchlist, Campus Reform, and College Fix. It is not a coincidence that the same groups behind these websites are also behind the Janus decision that in one fell swoop brought right to work to the public sector in an attempt to cripple public sector unions. Well, that's the bad news. What's the good news? The good news is we don't have to stand by and watch our profession, and with it, higher education as a public good, be destroyed by super rich corporate interests and extreme right-wing forces. We can fight back. I believe we can win, but it will not be easy. Perhaps at the risk of being red baited, I will share with you one of my favorite quotes from the preface of the first volume of Capital by Karl Marx. And he said, "There is no royal road to science, and only those who do not dread the fatiguing climb of its steep paths have a chance of gaining its luminous summits," unquote. I don't know that there's anything real controversial about that, but I thought it was well worded. This is the challenge that we face as individual scholars on a daily basis. But it is also a challenge we face as members of AAUP, as members of our profession, and as members of a movement. If we want to regain the high ground in higher education, we have a steep path to climb. But the real question is, do we have a choice? If we demur, our fate is certain. If we fight, there are no guarantees, but we have a chance. And in the immortal words of that great philosopher, Kojak, most of you are too young to remember that, Telly Savalas was a detective on TV, Kojak. And he said, if you want a guarantee, buy a washing machine. So no guarantees, but we can fight back. How do we fight back? In 2018, I gave a talk, what can college and university faculty learn from the teachers in West Virginia? And of course, many of you are too young to remember the movie The Graduate, but there's a scene there where Mr. McGuire is talking to Dustin Hoffman about his future, and he takes him aside and says, I want to just say one word to you, plastics. And well, I want to say one word to you, and that is union. And I bet some of you may be relieved because you thought I was going to say strike, but it's really not that. Seriously, I know that, people think that, I've heard this, different times. I live in a right to work state, or I live someplace where there's no enabling legislation, or, well, we have a union, but we're not allowed to strike. I think we need to first draw a distinction between unions and collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is a state-sanctioned process that on the one hand allows workers to unionize and bargain with employers, while at the same time placing certain restrictions on union activity. Collective bargaining is supposed to provide certain legal protections to employees, unions, and employers. And I use the word supposed to provide protections because the reality is today, both in the public and the private sector, that employees and unions have few, if any, real protections. To paraphrase our general counsel, Lisa Leibowitz, the law can have its uses, but it is not your friend if you are an employee or a union. Long before there was collective bargaining, workers had unions. They engaged in collective action to protect their interests. Collective bargaining is relatively new invention and designed to promote labor peace and avoid strikes, which, as many of you know, have a long and bloody history in the US. I'm from a state that has public sector collective bargaining, and the university where I was a faculty member for 35 years, Wright State, has had collective bargaining since 1998. On top of that, striking for faculty is legal in Ohio. And having just served a couple of years ago as a chief negotiator for the Wright State chapter during the second longest strike in a public university in the US, I want to assure you that striking is no panacea. If any of you have been there, you know it. Now, some of you may be sitting there thinking that, well, the faculty and other public sector workers in Ohio have it made because, they can go on strike, but, nothing could be further from the truth. The Janus decision notwithstanding, public sector collective bargaining has always been a lame duck session away from yeshiva language, annual recertification, and the loss of payroll deduction. Some of you may know that a few years back, the Ohio legislature passed Senate Bill 5, which would have effectively ended public sector bargaining in Ohio. And this bill came right on the heels of Act 10 in Wisconsin, which effectively did away with collective bargaining in for all public sector workers in Wisconsin. In Ohio, we were lucky enough to have a citizens referendum, and we collected millions of signatures to put the issue on the ballot and raise millions of dollars for advertising. We formed a coalition called We Are Ohio, and the AAUP was an important part of the coalition, which remains in existence to this day. We were victorious, and Senate Bill 5 was overturned. But today, if the legislature were to pass the exact same legislation, we would not be able to exercise our right to citizens referendum because the Republican Party has a supermajority in both the House and the Senate, and legislation passed by a supermajority is not subject to a citizens referendum. So what does it mean, when you have collective bargaining? Even with the right to strike, collective bargaining is no panacea. Employers still have most of the power, and the law is almost always on their side, especially in states where Republicans are in complete control. Even in states like New Jersey, where Democrats have had control of the legislature for years, there have been attacks on collective bargaining. Our chapter at Union County Community College in New Jersey had all of its shared governance language stripped out of its contract because of a change in state law. And it is like the oldest community college in the state of New Jersey. In states where there is collective bargaining, what happens when employers violate the law or ignore provisions in contract? Can a union just take them to court or to the labor board? Well, legal battles are extremely expensive, and many a union treasury has been depleted filing lawsuits, unfair labor practices, and taking grievances to arbitration. Ultimately, those unions that are successful in providing members with adequate protection and are able to win good contracts do so because they have political power. Political power starts with membership, but membership alone is not enough. That membership must be organized and active. Good contracts and strong unions don't happen because of smart bargaining at the negotiating table. They happen because members are willing to act collectively to defend their rights. In a different era, one might have just pointed to the South as a place most hostile to labor. But today there are 28 states where Republicans have a trifecta controlling all three branches of government. And these include states like Ohio. They did include Michigan, that has now changed. And of course it included Wisconsin, that has now changed, but includes Indiana, and I think New Hampshire. When people ask me, where I'm from, I always say I'm from Ohio, the Mississippi of the North, and I hope that I'm not insulting the people of Mississippi. And this brings me to an important point, that if you look at the South, after the end of the Civil War, there was a brief period known as Reconstruction, where former enslaved people had the right to vote, served in state legislatures in the South, and had a host of other rights. That ended rather quickly, ushered in by the end of Reconstruction and the establishment of Jim Crow, a form of state-sanctioned terrorism designed to take away the rights of African Americans in the South. And in fact, if you read the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, you'll see that many of the central features of the old Jim Crow system are still with us today. And of course, the latest of these is all of the changes that are now being passed on voting, which is, just a repeat of Jim Crow. But throughout this entire history, as well as today, there has always been organized resistance to this oppression in the South. And the resistance exploded into public view during the civil rights movement during the 1950s and 60s, when in the face of lynching, executions, and state-sponsored terrorism, African Americans won the right to vote along with certain other rights. There wasn't no enabling legislation passed allowing them to form organizations to fight for their rights. And of course, we know that this struggle continues and new forms of resistance are emerging as Black Lives Matter to address police killings of unarmed African Americans, particularly African American men, where all too frequently our legal system allows this to occur without punishing the perpetrators of their crimes. Similarly, there was no enabling legislation for women when the struggle for equal rights reemerged in the 1970s. And of course, this struggle continues because of courageous women who have stepped forward as part of the hashtag #MeToo movement. And many of these same women are stepping forward in record numbers to run for political office. And more importantly, they are leading the recent wave of teacher strikes. The point is that there has always been organized resistance, and when people have their rights trampled on and are treated without dignity, at times this resistance is hidden from our view, only to emerge by exploding onto the stage of public consciousness. And that is what was happening in West Virginia, Oklahoma, and Kentucky. And that's what's went on during this last election in a state like Georgia. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that later. I think we need to look at some of the lessons that we've learned with the recent defeat of Donald Trump, most likely the most anti-democratic president in American history, and the Democratic takeover of the Senate by the thinnest margin. These victories surprised many, particularly the winning of the 2 Senate seats in Georgia. While many point to demographic changes in explaining these victories, the real story lies in organizing. This organizing began long before this last election cycle, led by people like Stacey Abrams and organizations like Fair Fight, who have been doing grassroots organizing for years to build power. So what does this mean for college and university faculty? It means we need to act collectively, that if you act collectively at your place of work, effectively, you're forming a union. And, you know, if you look at what the AAUP, and this is a little bit out of date now because it doesn't exist and you can't see it anymore. Well, I'm sure you can see it somewhere, but it used to be on the CBC webpage, but we don't have the CBC anymore. But in any event, you know, organizing is a democratic form of building and maintaining an active membership base in order to effect change. The main principle behind successful organizing and behind the formation of AAUP chapters is collective action. When faculty speak and act with one voice, they demonstrate a large-scale commitment to issues around which they organize. Effective organizing results in a more equitable handbook and contract language, more robust shared governance, and better educational policies. And it takes many forms, and we listed these in bullet points: increasing memberships, moving members to be active in their chapter, communicating with members, planning and carrying out actions to improve conditions for both faculty and students, obtaining commitments from members to complete tasks and come to meetings and participate in actions, and building reciprocal relationships with allies. And I think I can't stress the importance of communicating with your members, especially, you know, I think when you're in negotiations. A lot of times it appears that if that's almost like a black box until there's a tentative agreement. And I know there are some people who will say that, well, you know, if you communicate with your members, it's an unfair labor practice, and so you can't do that. But, you know, that's just not true. You can bet that the administration's team communicates with the board of trustees and they let them know what's going on, and the president and the other leaders of your institution. And that's their constituency. Your constituency is your membership, and you need to communicate with them. There's a difference between, you know, bargaining in public and communicating about what is going on at the bargaining table. With any union, winning is almost never about who has the best negotiating team. It's great to have the best negotiating team. It's great to have people who are really smart and good at what they do. And I'm sure you have that at Oakland. But negotiating is not a debate. It is about the exercise of political power. Only rarely do unions win great victories relying on the legal apparatus provided by collective bargaining. Those who win good contracts and are able to enforce them do so via their political power, power that comes from forming an organization, paying dues that enables faculty to act collectively. The founders of AAUP established chapters as the basic foundation of the AAUP. And again, I'm not an expert on the history of the AAUP, but perhaps they realized that no national organization could serve as a grievance committee for the profession. The AAUP nationally makes policy, sets standards, it provides training and communications to its members, it helps faculty organize, but we don't have the resources to respond to every manifestation of the neoliberal agenda on every campus. Ultimately, the battle to save our profession will be fought out on each campus, in each state, and by building a broad national movement. I know faculty are busy teaching, doing research, and engaging in service, but think about the service that you do. How many wasted hours do you spend going to committee meetings? Spend some of that time knocking on doors when you get back from COVID, asking faculty to join the AAUP. How many times do you volunteer to do stuff to help out your department or college? Stop volunteering so much and uh, and stop doing some of the extra things you do to make your institution work and spend time building and running your AAUP chapter. Two things will happen. First, you will begin to make a real difference in the lives of faculty on a daily basis. And second, the administration will notice lots of the work that you used to do for free isn't getting done, and tell them, if you want us to do the work, you need to treat us fairly and with respect. We want a voice in determining how people will get raises, and we want a fair process for awarding of promotions and the granting of tenure. We want fair treatment and decent pay, including benefits for non-tenure eligible faculty. We want you to defend us when we're the victims of online harassment, and we want you to stand up for us and fight for more money in higher education with the state legislature, rather than sucking up to legislators and bringing us messages about, quote unquote, the new normal and doing more with less. But the real benefits of working in union go beyond the work we do on our campuses. We need to be at every legislative session to testify about the impact of changes that affect our institutions. We need to pool our resources statewide to defend tenure, whether in the legislature or in the courts. We need to expose the shameless conditions for part-time faculty and work with students to end exploitation of this group of faculty members. Faculty working together can develop a coordinated campaign to write op-eds, to talk to the press about how misplaced priorities of politicians and administrators are hurting the education our students receive on campus. Remember, faculty working conditions are student learning conditions. It's about the students, it's about the public interest. Beyond lobbying and talking to the press, it's time for us to get directly involved in politics. Until we can start electing people who really care about education and are willing to raise taxes on the wealthy to pay for it, your chapter can form a political action committee, can raise money for candidates for state offices that will support higher education, can get faculty or retired faculty to run for office. Of course, this will require working with other organizations and building alliances off campus. Beyond that, we need to rebuild and strengthen our state conferences. Michigan used to have one of the strongest state conferences in the country, but for some reason that still remains a mystery to me, it was dissolved. Yes, I know the Republicans won the trifecta in Michigan, making legislative work more difficult, but that work wasn't any more difficult than working in Ohio, where Republicans have been in control for years. In spite of Republican control and in the aftermath of the Janus decision, Ohio has still maintained a strong state conference, which is connected with the broader labor movement, having earned a seat at the labor table in the fight against SB 5. Michigan needs to rebuild its state conference. I know some of you are thinking, if AAUP gets involved in politics, we'll alienate some of our members. After the election of Donald Trump, I issued a statement pointing out, while the neoliberal agenda had been a bipartisan project, his presidency would represent neoliberalism on steroids. I pointed out that the attacks on the First Amendment did not bode well for academic freedom, and stated that his presidency represented one of the greatest threats to academic freedom since the McCarthy period. I also stated that his racist, xenophobic, and misogynistic statements and his behavior had emboldened his supporters on campus to engage in actions threatening the rights and human dignity of minorities, immigrants, and women. In hindsight, I was far too cautious and underestimated the impact the Trump presidency would have on our democracy. Our society today is so polarized that being involved in politics is unlikely to alienate many potential members. Although the federal government has an impact on higher education, something most of you are no doubt aware of, given the recent pronouncements, by the Trump administration, which hopefully now have been overturned, but with respect to the Duke UNC consortium on Middle East studies, that they needed to revise their offerings by September 22nd or risk losing future funding. So the real action to save higher education is at the state level. But if we don't get involved in politics, we'll be unable to change the forces that are attacking tenure, academic freedom, and shared governance and the economic security of our profession. They have the goal of reshaping higher education to serve wealthy and corporate interests, privatizing higher education, and driving up tuition. At a national level, however, a new effort has emerged to fight for, quote unquote, a new deal for higher education. And this effort is being spearheaded jointly by the AAUP and the AFT. The goal of this effort is to increase public funding and hold administrations accountable for how the money is spent. Spending should prioritize teaching and research and prioritize student success. Give access to all students, regardless of their ability to pay, and cancel student debt while ensuring job security, equitable pay, and a voice for faculty and staff. Finally, it would create an environment for scholarship free of racism, sexism, and other forms of bigotry that degrade learning and research and perpetuate inequality. You can learn more about this effort at newdealforhighereducation.org. And I saw just recently that the AAUP has even put up a web page on with an organizing toolkit around this new deal for higher education. We have an interest in creating an educated citizenry who will protect our democracy. In addition, we are responsible for educating and training doctors, nurses, social workers that we need to deal with the opioid crisis, or scientists to ensure we have clean drinking water and clean air, engineers to help reduce carbon emissions and stave off climate change and help us rebuild our crumbling infrastructure, managers who will not tolerate sexual harassment or racial discrimination, teachers so that every child has a shot at a first-class public education to meet his or her full human potential. The overwhelming majority of Americans, and likely the overwhelming majority of faculty, support these ideas and think that the best way to improve public services is to increase taxes on the wealthy and on corporations so they pay their fair share. And interestingly, in 1923, the book, The Goose Step, a study of American higher education by Upton Sinclair referred to AAUP as, quote unquote, the union for faculty. So if we're going to save our profession, we must make Sinclair's statement a reality. No matter where you live, no matter whether you have collective bargaining or whether your institution is public or private, you can organize and engage in concerted activity. You can organize and stand together. This is the lesson of the West Virginia's teachers' strike. They didn't have collective bargaining because there's no law that allows for public sector bargaining. They also are from a red state, a southern state, where 70% of the voters voted for Donald Trump. They don't have collective bargaining. Striking's illegal. They're in a red state, but they have a union, make no mistake about it. In West Virginia, they endured years of skyrocketing health insurance premiums, along with zero pay increases and salaries that had sunk to 48th in the country. But they recognized this was not just hurting teachers, but the students they serve. And so they went on strike for higher wages and better health care, but ultimately their struggle was about respect for them and the communities they serve. It was about the students. And that's a good lesson for all of us in all of our struggles. This lesson in addition to the lesson of the West Virginia teachers, we can see that standing together matters. This is the lessons of the victories of Raphael Warnock, the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, where Dr. Martin Luther King preached, and the first African-American from Georgia to be elected to the Senate, and John Ossoff, the youngest member of the Senate at 33 years old, and the state's first Jewish senator. So this was all done through organizing. Remember too that our struggle is not just about our jobs or even the education we provide our students. It's also about saving our democracy by ensuring that we have an educated citizenry and showing politicians bought by wealthy corporations that they cannot influence what we teach or the research we do. If the AAUP is to survive, and indeed, if our profession and our movement is to survive, we must change. In a post-Janus world where public sector collective bargaining is weakened, in a world where tenure no longer offers protection for academic freedom and shared governance for a majority of faculty, in a world where faculty face targeted harassment and legislative overreach, in a world where higher education is run as a corporate enterprise, and presidents and top-down administrators are paid like CEOs and managers of for-profit businesses, in a world where public funding for higher education is eroding so the wealthy can receive tax cuts and avoid paying their fair share for public services, where the threats to democracy increase daily, we need to change as an organization or risk becoming irrelevant. This is the reality we face, and there's no sugarcoating it. So has neoliberalism run its course? Can we get a New Deal for higher education? The answers to these questions will depend on whether Democrats have the courage to end the filibuster and pass H.R. 1 to ensure that every American has the right to vote. Ultimately, it will depend on organizing, building alliances, and working with others who think democracy is worth saving. Someone once told me that everybody wants change, but nobody wants to change what they're doing. If the AAUP is going to change, we are all going to have to change what we are doing and how we are doing it. And that is the struggle that is before us. So let me leave you then with a quote from Frederick Douglass, and that is, he said, quote, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress." Thank you.
Okay, Karen, say something.
Thank you very much, Rudy. Thank you very much. And I am hoping we can have some time to ask some questions and maybe let you flesh some of your ideas out or defend them, or however the questions go. Let's try to curate them a little bit, though. If you have a question, please raise, the little symbol there. Raise your hand, and either Amy or I will call on you, since we have multiple screens here. If no one asks questions, then I get to ask the question. So I'm going to give you another moment to think about it.
Why don't you start everybody else off, Karen, and they'll think about
Okay. Okay. Where do you see the most important points of friction about academic freedom? Do you see it more in the humanities, in the sciences? How do you view is there a cross-disciplinary threat to academic freedom, or is this something that is more focused in some areas as opposed to others?
Well, I think that I think it's really everywhere. I don't think that you can single out, I mean, anyone. There is no doubt about the fact that the biggest attack, I think, on college faculty is in the area of the humanities. And that, a lot of people are saying that, well, why do we need the humanities? That's a place to make cuts. History majors don't get jobs, which of course is complete bullshit. I mean, history majors, do get jobs. And as if the only reason, by the way, to get educated were to get a job, but nevertheless, so I think we see that attack there. And that's where, I think we see a lot of, kind of liberal attacks, but, in the sciences, and, it's not, engineering is not really all that political, but think about civil engineering and think of our infrastructure and, think about, just what we've seen, with COVID-19, if you don't think science is under attack, it is. And people have been, challenged, in medical schools or as scientists, so I think it really is everywhere. And it is something that that really should unite all of us, as opposed to, being divisive. So, I think that it's important for people who are outside of the humanities to, defend the humanities because, they're under attack. Just like it's important for people who are in the humanities to defend science, so I think it's, those attacks can, really come from, I think, anywhere now. And, I think that we're not seeing any limits.
Uh, Tom?
Yep, Tom's got his hand up.
Hi. So I have a question. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Oh, good. So not far from Rochester, where we're looking at you, I suppose, workers at a 7-Up factory are on strike, protesting a 2-tier wage system. Shortly before the COVID apocalypse, workers at General Motors went out on strike to protest the 2-tier wage system. I'm wondering, since higher education seems to be kind of ground zero for the adoption of 2-tier wage systems, when folks in higher education are going to follow our union brothers and sisters in other industries and make a 2-tier wage system a centerpiece of protesting what has reshaped higher education and provides, to, in my mind anyway, the single greatest threat to academic freedom that we see in the country, which is turning over an increasingly large amount of instruction and work of the university to faculty who have virtually no protection other than, and this is sort of the question, I suppose, other than their union contracts. I guess that's really not even a question, but if you could respond to that.
Yeah, I think it's it's a good observation, and I don't think it means, that, for example, I hear people say, being on strike, if you've ever been on strike, it's terrible. I think a lot of people kind of, glorify it or think that, oh, if you're a real union, if you do that. And I'm not saying that, striking obviously has to be done sometime. But I think the broader point really about, saying that, we need to get rid of this kind of two-tier system, is exactly right. And I think what we really need to do is first begin to educate the public and even our students about it. Most students walk in a class and they see a professor. They don't know the difference between a professor, an associate professor, an assistant professor, a lecturer, a part-time faculty member. They just know there's a professor up there. And that's a lot of what their parents know, or it's a lot of what, anybody thinks. And even people who are really highly educated, they, for example, do not understand how small a portion of a university's budget goes to paying faculty. When they think, I was just talking to some finance guy last night, and when I told him that, most of the people who work at, he was interested in Ohio State University. I said, people that they have a lot of administrators there. And they have 23,000 administrative and professional staff and something like 2,700 tenure and tenure track faculty there. And then of course they have an army of part-time faculty who are graduate students, right? So they don't have, at the places that are the big PhD granting institutions, in a lot of cases, their, contingent faculty are graduate students who, increasingly are trying to organize and have been treated, at least in the private sector, like a ping pong ball with the NLRB. Every time the White House changes, the NLRB changes its position on whether graduate students are employees or not. But, I think we need to really, educate students and community members that, better working conditions for faculty means that they will do a better job teaching students, and it will improve the quality of education. And that's when I said, in my talk, anytime when you have a contract campaign, if you try and make it about, the faculty and about the professors, people are, even maybe if they're sympathetic, a lot of them think, oh, geez, what do you do with all your time anyway? You only teach 2 or 3 classes. Boy, I wish all I had to do was work 2 or 3 hours, a few days a week. And that's kind of all there is to it, because they don't know what faculty do. And part of that is really, that's part of the organizing task, is to create, through social media, through op-eds, through maybe you can even use like ads on public radio, and talk about the important work that faculty are doing, or the difference that faculty members have made in students' lives, how they have helped students out. And when people see that, then they begin to see faculty differently. And when they begin to see faculty differently, they're going to support what you're doing, and that increases your political power, and it makes the job of your negotiating team at the table easier, because they know that you've got this hammer out there, right? That you've got this power that people in this community, whether it's religious organizations, civil rights organizations, other unions, student organizations, whatever other groups that are out there, having their support, because it's their university, right? It's a state university. It belongs, it's paid for by the taxpayers, or it's supposed to be. A lot of it's paid for now by tuition, unfortunately, and that's part of what's wrong. But that's, like the student debt. We should be opposed to student debt. we want to, we should be seeing, lower tuition, and not because we're willing to take pay cuts, but, because there should be more public support for higher education.
You're muted, Karen.
Uh, I just wanted to interrupt for a second. We have a little bit of time left, but the Zoom call may suddenly stop. So, because we don't know if it's going to let us go over or not. And we're getting close to the end of time. So I would like to just point out that as short as we can make our questions, then we can sort of primo Rudy's time for response. So, because we may suddenly disappear in 11 minutes. And I thank you very much for everyone cooperating with that. So Ken Mitten.
Do you want to
had a
make,
question.
do you want to say thank yous in case just it cuts out all of a
Oh,
sudden?
I'll just say thank yous in case. Okay. Then I was going to play it right up to the
Okay,
very
go
end.
right ahead.
No, that's okay. No, you're right. You are the voice of reason and sanity. That I would like to take a moment then to thank Rudy for coming and presenting interesting ideas to us. Some of these ideas I know have been percolating around on campus for some time, but in every single case, Rudy, you have given us a new dimension to this. And I thank you very much for your work here tonight and for coming and helping us out and giving us some thoughtful things to consider as we move forward into the great unknown future. And I would like to thank all of you in the audience for coming tonight and being interested in the sort of larger politics of the AAUP and interested in the bigger patterns that affect us that we don't necessarily see on a day-to-day basis, but in fact help to guide the direction that Oakland has been taking for the last 40 years maybe, but certainly the last 2 or 3 decades. So anyway, so if we have time then, yes, we do have a little bit of time. We're going to try to sneak in a couple more questions. So Ken?
Yes, quick one for you, Rudy. Do you have an example of an American institution that has managed to sort of reverse some of the trends and maybe increase the percentage of their tenure track jobs and maybe educated their students a little bit about those differences?
I don't know that I can point to an institution that, which isn't to say that they're not out there, but I think there are institutions that have definitely made real gains for, part-time and contingent faculty. Examples, would be the contract at the University of Oregon was, it's a wall-to-wall contract with everybody in the same bargaining unit. And I think it did really well. The PSC in their last contract got, I think had huge gains for part-time faculty. And I know that there is always, still dissatisfaction, but, nevertheless, they made some huge gains for part-time faculty. There are other places as well where, there have been some gains putting faculty on continuing employment agreements, which are like tenure. So those are some examples, but, there's no magic bullet out there.
Francine, I think you were the next one who had a hand up, so.
Hey, hi, Rudy, it was wonderful, very informative. We really appreciate it. Quick question, you mentioned the pack, forming a pack. Can you tell me a little bit more about that, and has it been successfully done at a university?
Can you repeat that again? I'm not sure that.
You heard me?
Yeah.
Okay. The pack, you mentioned forming a pack.
Oh, a pack. Oh, yeah.
Yes, yes.
You know, I don't know how successful, I know, for example, like the University of Cincinnati, I don't think they have a PAC, but I know that they contribute directly to, you know, political campaigns. They use their union treasury. At Wright State, they formed a PAC, but I don't know, you know, whether they, I mean, I think they, you know, helped do some fundraising for some candidates who were running for the state legislature. They, there, in fact, there was a faculty member who ran for the legislature. And so the PAC endorsed this faculty member and raised, you know, a little bit of money. I don't think it was much, but I mean, those were, you know, some examples. I know that, you know, it really kind of depends, like, you know, a state conference might be a good vehicle for forming some kind of a PAC as well, since, you know, there's a lot of issues that tend to be at state levels. And I'm just not sure, but it's, anyway, so I think that's a short answer to the question. I'm not really sure, but it seems like something we ought to explore.
I agree. Thank you.
Mhm. Darlene.
Thank you. So Rudy, thank you so much. I don't know who that beautiful woman is in the background at the kitchen sink, but she was closely attending and I appreciate that she has since stepped out. But I have a question. So you said that state level is the kind of conduit at which we should be advocating or have a voice at. And my question is, having started in 2009 and attending OU Capitol Day, where our administration seems to have a plug-in at the governor's level, where do OU faculty have a voice in competition? Maybe that's not a fair assessment, but in the ability to walk the same line if it's a different message in terms of advocating for faculty and this critical thinking mindset to our governor, who is Whitmer right now, but it was Rick Snyder at the time that they
Yeah.
entered, et cetera, et cetera. How do we work with the political nature?
I mean, you know, just to give you one example, I mean, there's a lot of legislators, for example, that don't realize for how much of a institution's money is going to intercollegiate athletics. And so one of the things, for example, that the Ohio Conference has done is to put out sort of like a fact book on education and to send it to legislators and to, you know, talk about, I mean, put out a statistic, like the statistic they just put out was $800 of every student's tuition goes to pay, or $800 a year goes to pay for intercollegiate athletics. And, you know, most of the legislators, they don't know that. They don't realize it. They probably think that all of the schools in Michigan are like the University of Michigan or Michigan State, and that, you know, athletics pays for itself. But it doesn't. It doesn't at Western, at Eastern, at Oakland, at Northern, at Central. None of those places. It's all money just being, you know, taken directly from your academic programs. I think there are other opportunities to testify, whether it's about, you know, like the debt of your students. Like, does the legislature really know, like, what is the average debt that a student has, and why is that? How does that affect them? So I think, you know, those are the kind of issues that could resonate with them. And frankly, you know, those are things that don't even really have to be partisan per se, but, you know, should resonate with legislators that are, you know, what are the universities really doing with the money? How many administrators do they really need? And showing them, you know, how that has changed over time. So, you know, those are, and when bills come up of, you know, just going and testifying, but always bringing to that, you know, like how it affects your students or how it affects the public, because that's what really matters to these legislators.
And I don't know where I'm at. Hold on. Sorry. So thank you for that, because I'm in the School of Education. So we have our pulse on where our legislature thinks about education, right? At a K-12 or P-12 level, let alone higher ed. So that's where my passion lies. And you're exactly right, because as I've watched OU get into that Horizon League and what that means for our swim team and our club sports and getting an OU football club. So thank you. You're exactly right. That kind of advocacy for faculty and students line and spending is so much more important, that maybe we could have a stake in moving to our legislature about those types of issues. So thank you.
I don't see any other questions. Karen, you're on mute.
See, that's what I get for being a good citizen. I keep turning myself off. Yeah, I don't see any more questions. And so I think probably what we should do is once again, thank Rudy for coming, and the comment. We're getting all sorts of lovely comments about how informative this was and how inspiring, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I just want to say that we're very happy that you were able to come, and thank you so much for sharing your time and your wisdom.
Well, you know, thank you for inviting me, and I really appreciate it. And I look forward to maybe seeing some of you at, not this summer, but at a future summer institute. You know, I'm sure that I'll hopefully still be around to be trying to teach people and you know, work with people. So hopefully get to see some of you in person, and, you know, good luck with your negotiations, and keep me posted on how things are going.
We will do that, and we will keep you apprised of all of our progress, which I am hoping will be extraordinary. And that
Good.
my goal is that other schools will talk about how good we do things. So anyway, well, thank you once again. And we hope you have a lovely evening and stay safe. And hopefully we will see you soon at Summer Institute.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Rudy.
All right.